So it looks like Caitlin's dad was right. I won't live to see 40. I suppose you've got to give credit where it's due. Although in fairness, that prick thought I'd wind up flatlining under a bridge with a needle sticking out of my ass, not stranded on a desert island. Anyway, my name's George, and this is my diary. I always thought these things were a bit stupid and pointless. Still do. But Caitlin's asleep and I've run out of pebbles to skip across the water. So here's the story so far. Once the tide rolled in, the boat drifted off and sank. Kat and I escaped by jumping overboard, but she landed badly on a rock. Now her left ankle is an ugly purple bruise. She keeps insisting that it doesn't hurt all that much, but this is a woman who could look on the bright side of a black hole, so take that for what it's worth. I salvaged some supplies from the wreckage, including a water bottle, the food we brought along, crackers, cheese, a pineapple, 3 bananas, some beef jerky, a knife, this little notebook, binoculars, and a flashlight. I also held on to Caitlin's gift, although I can't say more about that in case she reads this letter, which if you are Angel Face, sorry for ruining your 31st birthday. Earlier, I joked about having the beach to ourselves and how romantic the sunset looked. Caitlin half laughed and half sobbed. I can tell she's anxious and the rescue mission might take a while since it's unlikely anybody even realizes we're missing yet. Call that karma for using her parents' summer house without permission. So far, the weather's great. Not too hot, not too cold. It's the perfect time of the year to get shipwrecked, I guess. At low tide, red and orange crabs swarmed over the seaweed-covered rocks in the bay, but they scurried into the water whenever I got too close. The yappy seabirds are way too fast to catch as well. Still, if we're careful, we can stretch out our supplies to last a week or so. I think. I mean, I'm no Bear Grylls, but that's just how it looks. The island doesn't seem all that big, although it's hard to tell because there's trees and valleys everywhere. Tomorrow the plan is for me to head inland and see how alone we really are. If I get lost, I'll walk until I hit the coast and follow it back here. It's like keeping one hand against a maze wall. Best case scenario, there's other people around. Maybe a lighthouse keeper or eccentric billionaire who owns the place. If not, fingers crossed some passing fisherman spots Caitlin. Anyway, that's all for now. Ciao. Day 2. So there's some crappy news, some amazing news, and some seriously shitty news. First, the crappy news. The island's bigger than I thought, and there's bushes, ferns, and tall grass everywhere, which means it's impossible to take more than 20 steps in a single direction. Out east, I found a rocky mound. It was about 80 foot high and fairly steep, but there were exposed roots and boulders I could use for grip, which meant I reached the summit before dusk. That leads us on to the amazing news. Up there, I looked around through the binoculars and spotted a shack and a rowboat on the southern side of the island, way in the distance. They're on a narrow stretch of beach surrounded by cove. The problem is, navigating the island's gonna be tricky. To cross it, we'll need to march through a dense forest with bald patches covered in bumpy hilltops. Solo, I could make the journey in a day, I think. When Kat heard the news, she jumped up, then grimaced while holding her ankle. Because of the limited supplies, time is against us. She suggested I go solo then. If the shack's unoccupied, row the boat around to collect her, without slamming into the rocks this time. Although I'm against this suggestion for 2 reasons. Number 1, that would mean splitting up the supplies and we've only got 1 water bottle. Number 2 is the shitty news. There's 3 crucifixes planted beside the shack, spaced out in the sand. That feels like an excessive amount. What if some recluse started a cult out here where they could perform crazy ritual sacrifices? Hell, maybe those crosses mark the graves of previous castaways. Part of me thinks we might not want to meet this individual or individuals. That said, the alternative is dying a painful thirst and getting our eyeballs pecked out by gulls. I suppose it's possible whoever built the place is long gone, although I doubt they'd have left their boat in that case. Kat got me laughing a while back. My hands look like they've gone through a paper shredder because of the climb. which set her off grumbling about infections. Pointed at her inflated ankle and said I'd be a real asshole if I cried about some measly cuts. She'd always been like that, more concerned about others than herself. Now I think about it, she's in a weirdly upbeat mood. Even for her, she keeps joking about how we might want to stay lost rather than have her dad find out what happened. It's better than her writhing around in agony, I guess. Since she looked drained, I let her rest her ankle on my lap while I massaged her shoulders. I'd be lying if I said the part of me didn't enjoy being her guardian angel for a change. Anyway, that'll do for now. Adios. Day 2, Entry 2. Angelface found her gift while I was off exploring. That's why she kept making jokes. She knows her dad's gonna have a stroke when he finds out I sunk his precious boat and proposed to his daughter in the same week. She slipped the ring back into the bag, but she couldn't have been more obvious if she grew a tail and started wagging it. She says the ring's perfect, which came as a relief. I can picture her dad casually mentioning the one he bought his wife cost £25,000. To celebrate our engagement, I went and picked some pink wildflowers. Afterwards, we had beef jerky followed by pineapple chunks. To cap the evening off, we lay down and held each other. The warmth of her body felt nice. This is so typical me. I get engaged to the most beautiful woman on the planet, days before deranged cultists carve out my intestines. I shouldn't make those kind of jokes. Think positive, George. Au revoir. Day 3. Last night, Caitlin heard a twig snap from out in the forest. She grabbed the flashlight, but anytime she pointed the beam, we only saw branches shake and dip. Neither of us moved or said a single word, just listened to the hypnotic ocean waves. Then right as my eyelids drooped shut, Kat shrieked. She insisted a tiny pair of arms wrapped around a trunk like somebody was hugging it from behind. For the next few hours, every minor sound, even just the whistling wind, made her yelp and waste more battery power searching the spaces between the trees. At dawn, I suggested a boar maybe picked up the scent of a jerky and came sniffing around, and soon Caitlin had a purple face to match her ankle. She accused me of calling her delusional, which I didn't. Since our stomachs wouldn't quit grumbling, we finished the leftover jerky and washed it down with some water. Unfortunately, my blistered hand couldn't hold on to the stupid bottle, so a portion of our reserve leaked into the sand, which made Kat snap and say her dad was right about me. We tested whether she could walk alone. She barely managed 10 steps in the sand, which means the island's gonna be borderline impossible. Problem is, my strength's dipping every day, the supplies are dangerously low, and unless the potential cult leader is both real and friendly, I'll need to haul Kat through the forest and then paddle us both to the mainland. Oh, I almost forgot. She insisted we waste even more energy by relocating to the far side of the bay. There's a ridge against our backs here. After I laid out our supplies on a flat patch of rock, Kat apologized for her earlier jab. We kissed and made up and agreed we'll set off tomorrow, no matter what. Fingers crossed a single banana and some cheese keeps me fueled up. All we can do now is wait. Day 4. It came back. Sometime after Caitlin pointed out a glowing set of eyes moving between trees, they slipped out of view when I shouted, "Who's there?" Wood snapped, then the moonlight shining through the branches blacked out as something swooped from left to right. Caitlin screamed. I pointed the beam but only saw leaves floating down. To preserve the battery, I only used a flashlight whenever we heard or spotted movement. Each time I flicked the switch, twigs snapped, or footsteps trampled through dead leaves. This went on and on. By dawn, it felt like I doused my eyes with salt water. My parched throat still aches from the big blowout Caitlin and I had about how much of the last banana I was eating. She only shut up when I told her she could have more of it if she carried herself. Our remaining supplies got crammed inside the pack. Together they weigh about 10 and 15 pounds, which feels like a lot when you haven't had a proper meal in almost a week. Even though I only half carried, half hugged Her Royal Highness, it felt like hauling a boulder around on my shoulders. At one point I mentioned this and she shoved me away, and since then she's only answered my questions with childish one-word responses. Further inland, the ground got bumpy. Those hills weren't steep, but they never ended. The amount of time we wasted catching our breaths is ridiculous. Every bird taking off made us jump. Also, we tripped on every fucking tree root, then we'd waste time fighting, again. We pushed on until my leg muscles started spasming, then stopped inside a ring of trees. There's crisscross branches everywhere, plus a gap in the canopy. I napped so I can keep watch all night. If that thing followed us here, we're fucked. Dad, if you're reading this, sorry for being such a shit before. I always meant to repay your love and kindness when I started doing better financially. P.S. You were right. I should have stayed in school. Day 6, I think. We're fucked. Last night that thing slipped between trees and bushes. I grabbed the knife and went over and kicked one, but nothing happened. I waited a while, and then Caitlin screamed. There was glowing eyes above her in the canopy. The thing dropped on her and bit her. It looked pale and thin and small like a child. I couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl. Its clothes were old and its skin peeled when I grabbed its head. There's still wet chunks under my fingernails. It smells horrible. The creature was small but strong. My feet lifted in the air as I stabbed it in the face and neck. Its lip was all sideways. I got it in the chest before it threw me off. I thought I landed on a stick, but the snap was my ribs. Breathing isn't easy now. The thing hissed like a snake. Its teeth looked like needles, or a porcupine. It ran off on all fours with the knife sticking out. Caitlin's thigh looked like minced beef. Black veins are showing through. I put bandages on and she said it burns and kept swatting my hand away, calling me a useless fuck. After a while she said sorry. I told her sorry for fucking up our lives. I told her dad was right. She said no, her dad's a prick, and we both laughed. Then she spat out a tooth. I fucking love her so much, man. She needs a doctor. I didn't tell her carrying her makes her hard to breathe now. I found a blood trail on the knife. It was in a patch of red flat grass. Not sure if that's good. The thing looked like a child. What if its parents live at the shack? We might be fucked. I'm a murderer. I carried her south until my feet hurt. Now we're resting. A few minutes ago she spat out another tooth. The boat can't be that much further. I want to sleep but can't in case Caitlin gets bad, so I'll write instead. She keeps talking about how we met. I remember it well. She found me overdosing in an alley and shook me awake and said the ambulance was coming. I could only make out her pretty features and copper hair. I was so fucked up I thought I was dead. I kept asking if she was an angel and telling her she looked like one. She still looks like one. Day, I'm not sure. We found the shack. No one lives here. There's water, also jarred fruits. I ate and drank, but I'm afraid to sleep. Caitlin might die. There's way more crucifixes, but they'd all broken because the rope rotten and they're bundles of sticks really. Caitlin is on the beach. She's pale and sweaty and doesn't want the heat. Won't come inside either. Thrashes around whenever I try. Also, she's spitting teeth. Lots. Her lips are flaky. She keeps complaining about how thirsty she is. I give her water, but she couldn't keep it down. Second time she grabbed the ring off her finger and told me to stick it up my ass because it's cheap and shit. Whoever built this place is gone. All I found were framed photos of a man in glasses and a girl. Maybe his daughter. She looks about 7, maybe 8. And I killed her maybe. There was so much blood. Soon we're casting off. I fell asleep after the last entry. When I woke up, Caitlin had vanished. A sand trail led me south. I found her in the cave in the shadows. She was standing around like she never hurt herself. Kept saying she felt fine, except she looked pale and washed out and her lips were all cracked. I didn't like it. I didn't like how she kept asking me to come inside the cave. Her voice sounded different. I went forward slowly. When we were close, she grinned. Now I could see her eyes. They looked silver and glowy. The second I stopped, she hissed. Her teeth were sharp. I ran back here to the shack. It's getting dark, so I can't cast off. Too risky. This is so fucked. Why is she better? How? Caitlin keeps knocking on the door, asking if she can come in. Too afraid to answer. She keeps pawing at the walls and saying she's thirsty, asking if I remember how we met. Caitlin's on the roof. I can hear footsteps. She wants me to let her in. Before she asked nice, but now she's screaming. She says I deserve to die for getting us stranded. She said she helped me through my relapses and got me clean. She didn't list to her dad saying to leave me and I'm a terrible selfish person, and she's right. Can't stop crying, this is so fucked. Those silver eyes are watching me from a gap between the boards. Kat still wants me to go outside. She keeps talking about how much she loves me. Says if I love her, I'll go outside. Now she's crying because the thirst hurts. I love her, but I'm scared. I'm so fucking scared. This will be my last entry. Caitlin went back to the cave before dawn, and I accidentally slept leaning against the door. When I finally went out to look around, there were silver eyes watching me from the cave. The mainland isn't far. I'm casting off. If you find this, I'm sorry I killed the girl, and I'm sorry I left Caitlin. Can't believe this is how I repay her for everything. I'm the biggest piece of shit on earth. Angel face, I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. Someone please rescue her. It might not be too late. Also bury the little girl. Day 1 since rescue. Writing this down is a terrible idea, but I need to get my thoughts straight. After the last entry, I pushed the boat out to sea and paddled east. Every stroke felt like a branding iron between my ribs. The marina drifted into view around midday, then a yacht came speeding toward me. I waved it down, relieved, only to discover Kat's dad was the skipper. I almost hurled myself overboard. He hauled me up onto the yacht and drove his forearm into my throat, pinning me against the cockpit. It's a miracle he didn't suffocate me. While I gasped for air, my vision all blurred. He explained how he'd called his daughter to wish her a happy birthday 1 week ago, and when neither she nor her junkie boyfriend answered their phones, he panicked. 3 days later, when a neighbor called to say his boat had disappeared, he put 2 and 2 together. Since the Coast Guard were a shower of useless bastards, he launched a one-man search operation. With his story told, he eased some pressure so that I could answer one question. Where's Caitlin? When I begged for water, he drove his knee into my stomach. Breathless, I lay in a fetal position, explained how he capsized, and that he needed to leave a weakened Cat behind to go summon help. If not for my feeble condition, he probably wouldn't have accepted such vague answers. Luckily, his concern for his daughter blinded him. He let me devour chicken sandwiches and orange juice while we sailed back to the island, although I think that was more so I didn't die of starvation before guiding the way. By the time we arrived, it was late afternoon. Glowing eyes watched us approach from inside the cave. I pointed feebly and said Caitlin was in there. Her dad pulled up as close as possible and insisted I go with him, probably so I couldn't leave him behind to die. He climbed overboard into the water and past the beach. When I refused to cross the mouth of the cave, the bastard grabbed me by the throat, again. I caught him off guard with a headbutt, then blood gushed from his nostrils. A knee slammed into my chest, then 2 kicks to the midsection made me fall flat on the ground, clutching my burning ribs. If my future-in-law hadn't spotted Caitlin lurking in the shadows, I'd probably be dead by now. He rushed forward, crying out for his baby girl, who flew straight at his chest the instant he charged beyond the light. She pinned him down, her needle-like fangs bared, then tore chunks of flesh of his neck. The anguished half-gurgle, half-scream almost made me feel sorry for the guy. Almost. Caitlin stood, wiping blood off her mouth. Despite the red stain, she looked more like the woman I fell in love with. less gaunt and washed out than before. She sounded like her old self too, that sharp edge that crept into her voice after the attack had vanished. Fighting back the tears, she looked over at me and asked if she was a monster. My eyes flicked toward her father's remains, which were basically a withered husk by that point, before I held her in my arms and said no. She kept begging me for forgiveness, said she couldn't help the way she came after me before, that her craving took over. A painful thirst, she kept calling it. I caressed the back of her skull, whispering this didn't change anything. Because the sunlight stung, Caitlin refused to come with me on the boat. I searched the shack for a white scarf and wrapped it around her skull, leaving a narrow slit for her eyes. But before I even got knee-deep in the ocean, the scarf bloomed pink. Caitlin's hands tightened into fists as fresh blood ran down her neck, and then she scrambled for safety of the beach. She kept insisting being in the water felt wrong. She said that when I led her towards the cabin too, until I invited her inside where she unwrapped her hand. Beneath the scarf, her delicate features looked more beautiful than ever, crusted blood and all. We held each other, sobbing until there was no tears left. Then after we talked about our predicament, I set sail for the mainland to figure things out. At the marina, my disheveled appearance received some funny looks from other sailors, although nobody said anything. No doubt people are asking questions though. Now I'm at Kat's parents' summer house. I slept in her father's bed, grilled myself a steak in his kitchen, and even drank his fancy imported beer. Apart from the aching ribs, I'm feeling worlds better now. Caitlin's gonna need fresh meat, or a blood bank, whatever you want to call it. I haven't decided my next move yet, but no matter what, I won't abandon her. Not after everything she's done for me. Whatever else happens, I'm sticking with my guardian angel. Kat, I love you. I'll always love you. And we're gonna figure this mess out together, no matter what. My goal was to record a solo album at the cabin by the lake. I'm certainly not the first musician to do this. Google cabin fever and see for yourself. The cabin was built by my great-grandfather and has remained in the family ever since. Naturally, it's been spruced up over the years. It now has running water, a high-powered generator for electricity, plus an indoor toilet, a recent addition after a bat got tangled in my ex-wife's hair while she was having a tinkle. Which leads me to why I came out here in the first place, in the middle of Nowheresville, Ontario, in the cold of the early spring. My marriage ended 2 weeks before Christmas. My wife dumped me, then she made off with her younger and more handsome coworker Carl. I hate Carl, but I digress. Needless to say, I was at a crossroads, thus I started writing songs. Once I scratched out the first couple songs, the floodgates opened and the rest followed accordingly. By the end of January, I composed enough songs for a solo acoustic album. Promised myself I wouldn't call the album Cabin Fever. I brought 2 acoustic guitars, my Gibson J100 and a vintage Harmony, circa 1960, which I used for open tuning and slide guitar. I also brought some hand drums and shakers, a plethora of high-quality microphones in my laptop, plus a bottle of single malt scotch and a plenty of grub. It's a 3.5-hour drive straight north. The cabin is so far off the beaten path that not even Google knows of its existence. I've done this drive more times than I can count, but it's never easy. I got lost on my way up, and not for the first time. Eventually, after doubling back, I found the correct side road and made it just before sunset. Not a good way to start. Things were about to get worse. The cabin was eerily quiet. Darkness was impending, so I quickly got to work. First I lit the kerosene lanterns, then I started the generator and checked to see if the toilet was working. It was. There was enough chopped wood and kindling to last all week if needed. I fired up the wood stove, the cabin warmed up wonderfully, then I unloaded my gear and put the food away. Finally I could relax. I sighed as my buttocks hit the familiar feel of the old leather couch. A lifetime of memories surrounded me. Mom's rocking chair cradled in the corner. Dad's Remington hanging dutifully on the adjacent wall next to the mounted antlers. The collection of family photos on the mantelpiece, including a picture of me with my beloved grandmother, taken at this very cabin, and a wedding photo of my ex-wife in her stunning gown, somewhere off the coast of St. Lucia. I rested my feet on the coffee table and sipped my drink, trying not to tear up. Unfortunately, my mind scurried down the wrong rabbit hole, and I was lured into a deep depression. My life was in shambles, and this was rock bottom. Filled with grief, I found solstice in the bottle until sleep took me under its spell. Day 1, I woke to strange noises. What the heck is that? I rubbed my eyes. My mouth was as dry as a musician's sense of humor. My head hurt. I needed water and Tylenol pronto. I'm too old for this, I reminded myself. No more booze, I promised. I had an album to record. I made a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs and strong coffee. I ate ravenously. All the while, the scraping noises continued. They were coming from the lake. This cabin was built on the peninsula. It's completely surrounded by water and tall trees. This type of solitude can induce claustrophobia and/or agoraphobia in certain individuals. This cabin certainly has a dark history in that regards. My grandmother committed suicide here back in the 80s. It was tragic. She too was a musician. I should check that out, I grumbled while groping my coffee mug. Better grab the gun on the way out just in case. As always, the view was stunning. The soft morning sun sparkled over tops of trees, which provide plenty of shade in the afternoon. The deck is cozy with enough room to sit and read a paperback while enjoying a generous backdrop. Beyond the deck lurks McName Lake. With squinted eyes, I scanned the ashen lake. Aside from the blustering breeze sweeping up pieces of icy snow and the gaggle of Canadian geese bobbing about their business, the lake was deserted. And then it hit me. The lake ice was rubbing against itself. It's thawing. This is normal. Lakes do that this time of year. This should be obvious. I shrugged my paranoia off as jitters. I was in solitude, with no internet, surrounded by a lake that's making strange noises. I'll get over it. Time to get to work. Having set up shop in the living room, I placed a microphone in close proximity to my guitar, and 3 more in various spots around the cabin, including one strategically placed on the ceiling, hoping to capture the full spectrum of sound. I placed the vocal mic in front of me and tuned the guitars ready to roll. With the instruments and recording equipment in check, I went about setting up the cameras. My iPhone provided a close-up of my guitar work, while my GoPro captured the full performance as well as the ambience of the rustic cage. My iPhone provided a close-up of my guitar work while my GoPro captured the full performance as well as the ambience of the rustic cottage. It was slow going at first, my fingers were clumsy, my voice lacking confidence. I couldn't find my groove. It's not every day one finds themselves alone in a 100-year-old log cabin encapsulated by a creaky lake. My voice and my fingers needed time to warm up. By the 3rd cup of coffee, things started to improve. It was tiresome, but by the end of the day I managed to record 3 songs: Hard Luck and Trouble, Country Livin' Whiskey Drinkin', and a spiteful little number called So Long to Know You. Nightfall came. After enjoying a steak dinner and some scotch, I retired to the couch. So far so good. Day 2. I awoke with a terrible sweat, shaking. Nightmares dissolved into my mind like ice cubes slipping into a cool drink on a warm day. I forced myself out of bed, urinated, then went straight for the coffee maker. Coffee in hand, I meandered to the deck, ready to relax and have a cup. Before I could nestle into a lawn chair, however, something weird happened. A brisk breeze brushed the back of my neck, sending a searing shot coursing through my body, spilling my coffee in the process. What the? Something whizzed past me. I wasn't alone. I went for my gun and didn't dawdle. Then I searched the premises, gun in hand, looking for any intruders. It's a small plot of land. It didn't take long. The snow on the ground had recently melted. In its place came a mixture of cranky mud and slippery slosh. Chomping along the cold, sodden soil made me miserable. My feet were soaked. Then I noticed the track marks. The tracks were like any I'd seen, long, curvy claws at the tip, cut deep and wide, bear-like, except twice as large and spaced further apart. Judging from the depth of them, the thing was orangutan. I scratched my head. Something about the track marks seemed wrong. I returned to the cabin and fetched my phone. I wanted to document them, so when I'm back in Wi-Fi I can search them up. The problem was, when I returned, the tracks were gone. I was bewildered. This was a different version of outside. Moments ago, the morning was full of birdsong. Not anymore. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief. I gotta get out of here, I said, not trusting the sound of my voice. Don't be ridiculous, I answered. I just got here. I was right. I marched back inside the cabin and put the shotgun back into its rightful spot on the wall. I poured myself a fresh cup and drank my coffee in quiet desperation. Something wasn't right. The air in the cabin was too thick. The silence was deafening. I had nearly forgotten my true purpose for coming here. My eyes glanced at the old Winchester next to the antlers and remained there for an uncomfortable length of time. Too weary to eat, I unlatched my acoustic guitar case and pulled out my Gibson, placing it neatly on the stand. When I opened the other case, it was empty. I panicked. That old harmony was irreplaceable. I ran outside, gun in hand, murder in mind, but of course nothing was there. I fled to the cabin ready to give up and go home. To my surprise, my old harmony was sitting on the stand next to the Gibson, gleaming. Impossible. Had it always been there? I shrugged. With shaky hands, I strummed a chord. It was in tune. Reluctantly, I fired up the laptop and went to work. The first song I recorded was a Delta blues number called Hammer Song, both a tribute to Hammertown, Ontario, as well as a nod to American folk legend John Henry. The song came out swimmingly. I tried my hand at it again, but nothing beat that first take. The blues licks were ferocious, the vocals drenched in gut-wrenching soul. I was pleased, so much so that I had woken my appetite. I plundered through some bacon and eggs, and then I made a rough mix of the song. It needed something special, so I added some shakers and a djembe for support. That's when I noticed the applause. First I thought it was the percussion, but upon further review it was more than that. Underneath my voice and guitar was an actual audience. For real. They were clapping along, cheering sporadically, even catcalling from time to time. I pulled up the files from the laptop looking for visual clues as to where the sound was coming from, but I found none. Instead, my laptop slammed shut. I leapt out of my chair screaming in surprise. "Who's in here?" I shouted. "Show yourself." Someone was in the cabin. It was undeniable at this point. "Do you want me to leave?" I regretted asking this. Truth be told, I wanted to stay. I had work to do, not to mention my grand finale. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, and then I grabbed my Gibson and strummed an open G chord. It sounded like an ocean. I restarted my computer, pressed record, then began picking through a tune called Sorry Again. Sappy fingerstyle song I wrote shortly after my marriage ended. Again, I nailed it on the first take. As I finished the final chord, I was surprised to see the glow of the setting sun peeking through the adjacent window. I checked the time, 7:51 p.m. That's not right, I told myself. But it was. Apparently time was not on my side. The day was spent in hours, but the music was effortless. After blending the guitar with the vocals, I pressed play and was immediately awestruck. My voice was divine, my guitar an orchestra. That said, I didn't know what to make of the voices. With the volume turned up on the headphones, you could hear them chattering amongst themselves at the quiet parts, singing along to their favorite parts. Judging from the recording, you'd think I was performing to a live audience. At least they're applauding, I said in a wobbly voice. I'd hate to see what would happen if they were displeased. By now it was pushing 11 p.m. As ludicrous as that was, I made some canned ravioli and washed it down with a single malt scotch. Just a little, I reminded myself. No more hangovers. I added another log to the fire and then I slipped into a deep and troublesome sleep. Day 3. Something startled me awake, a noise coming from outside. I'd been having a nightmare. In it, I was being chased through the woods by a grisly monster. Bizarrely, the monster was singing, but I didn't recognize the song, nor did I understand the words. Those sinister sounding syllables, however, stayed with me as I stooped over the couch, scared shitless. After emptying my bladder, I grabbed the gun and grumbled outside. The air was basement damp and chilled me to the bone. A copse of soggy black spruces bordered the semi-frozen lake, the leaves ridding themselves of the last night's rainfall. To my horror, those inhuman claw marks emerged from the lake, making great strides, leading to the back of the cabin. I cocked the gun, then sprinted around to the deck, fully expecting a confrontation. The deck was empty, save for a paperback resting on a crooked lawn chair with coffee stains dripping down its side. The lake cranked out a creepy sound, startling me. Then something nuzzled the nape of my neck. I gotta get out of here, I snapped. I rushed inside and began the daunting task of packing up. Yet, as I was putting my guitars away, something prevented me from doing so. I couldn't bring myself to leave. Instead, I re-listened to the work I'd done on day 1. The songs were extraordinary. That said, the auspicious audience was impossible to ignore. I was furious. Someone or something was hijacking the mixes. My mind jumped to many conclusions, each scarier than the last. Ultimately, I shrugged it off. What choice did I have? I tuned up the old harmony and cut the 6th song. A blues number using dad-gad tuning called Fell in Mud. This was my most difficult song to play. Originally, my plan was to record the guitar first and then overdub the vocals afterwards, but I decided against it. Instead, I recorded it in one take. Unbelievable. I was stunned by my performance. My voice was gnarly, full of emotion, my finger picking precise and with purpose. The audience filled in the quiet bits. The idea that I wasn't alone was indeed freaking me out. But the results spoke for themselves. So, with the butterflies swirling in the pit of my stomach, I reached for my Gibson, flat pick in hand, looking to keep the momentum going. I tuned up and then pressed record. I strummed the G7 chord, letting it sustain. Then, as I leaned into the opening riff of The Devil I Know, someone spoke my name. I jumped out of my seat, my blood went cold. I hate being interrupted. "Who's there?" I spat. My voice fell to the floor with a thud. I knew it wasn't safe here, but the allure of my tobacco-burst Gibson guitar was irresistible. Sat back down, took a deep breath, and hit record. Sure enough, just as I started the riff, a voice spoke inside my headphones. This time I kept playing. Although my hands were shaky, I managed to complete the song. It wasn't perfect, so I did another take, and then another. With each take, I was bombarded with bellows and hollers from the omnipresent audience. After 9 tries, I finally got it. Wearily, I mixed the vocals with the blended guitars until I produced a pleasing sound. Upon playback, those spectators were as pesky as ever. "I'll have to fix that when I get home," I said, stone cold terrified. Having eaten dinner and tidied up, I loaded some wood into the stove before collapsing onto the couch. I was spent. Darkness engulfed me. The walls were closing in, the air difficult to breathe. Panic turned to despair. Would anyone notice if I disappeared? Would anyone care? No, I was insignificant. The world would go on without me, as if I'd never existed. The wretchedness of my personal life came flooding back, all the while my eyes fixated on the shotgun on the wall. "You came here to kill yourself," I reminded myself. I nodded. My plan was to go out with a bang. I'll make my final record, a masterpiece that the world would remember me by. Then I'll place the barrel of the shotgun into my mouth and blow my brains to smithereens, Cobain style. "You're not gonna chicken out, are you?" I asked. I shook my head. "Good. Stick to the plan." Footsteps startled me. They were approaching at an alarming speed, crunching through the crisp foliage, stopping outside the cabin door. My stomach turned over. I stifled a scream. Carefully, I tiptoed towards the gun and removed it from the rack. Whatever was behind that door better start praying. "Who's there?" I asked. At first, nothing happened, and then I heard the voice of a woman. "Lucas," she whispered from all around me. I stumbled backwards as if drunk. I regained my composure and then pointed the gun at the door. "Identify yourself or I'll blow you straight to hell." I gripped the gun with cold certainty. I was going to kill something. The voice whispered once again, only this time more forcefully. "Lucas." I know my own name. Something crashed outside the door and that was all it took. The shotgun blast took a huge chunk of door with it. I peeked outside and nobody was there, nor were there any track marks, just mud and trees and lake. The moon was precarious. A lone wolf cried out, shattering the silence. The loneliness of the howling wolf made me weep. "I must be losing it," I said, wiping the stream of fresh tears from my face. I shook my head. That's not true. I'd already lost it. That's what brought me out here in the first place. I regarded my decimated door with utter disdain, then shivered. The bitter breeze wafting into the cabin was unwelcoming. Without a second thought, I fetched some tarpaulin and duct tape from the shed and went to work patching the door. It took the better part of an hour, but it did the trick. Fatigue held me in its tiresome grip. Meanwhile, my ears continued their incessant ringing from the weapon's disorderly discharge. I sprawled out on the couch, and for the first time since arriving, I slept soundly. Day 4. I woke up well rested, ready to roll. Speckle of pale light sprinkled into the cabin, as did a newfound sense of purpose. Nothing was going to stop me from completing this album. If I really pushed myself, I told myself, while loading the coffee maker, I could finish the album today. This was true, but I'd have to go hard. I could mix the rest of the songs at home. I opened my laptop ready to get started and was surprised by a crimson face flashing across the screen. Its primordial eyes sunk deep into its cheekbones. Its toothy snarl made me cringe. The laptop gurgled and then went blank. Suddenly, I was frozen with fear. My eyes darted towards the shotgun. "You haven't lost the nerve, have you?" I asked myself in a chilling voice. I shook my head and then forced my attention away from the gun and instead warmed my hands over the wood stove. My guitar case opened itself. Apparently, I should get back to work. The feeling that I was under a spell was irrefutable. I strummed an E chord. The The sound filled the cabin with rich overtones, as though in a dream. I leaned into the next song, Eyes on You, a weepy ballad about how I met my ex-wife. Halfway through the tune, I felt something tugging forcefully at my leg. I sprung from my chair in surprise, ruining the take, and I swore under my breath, and then I started up again. Although the entire performance was fraught with stabs and jabs from the invisible bystander, with an endless choir singing along with each chorus, I crushed it. Without second thought, I placed my capo on the 7th fret and found my thumb pick. Then I ran through a fingerstyle blues with a gospel twist called After the Rain. It would prove to be another first taker. I was on a roll. The afternoon flew by like a midsummer's dream. As the evening sun descended across the marmalade sky and the cascade of stars illuminated the world above me, I finished my album. Soon afterwards, I slept and was feasted upon by an endless cycle of nightmares. Day 5. Morning filled the cabin with light. As the memories of dreamlike monsters faded, I forced myself off the couch. The laptop came alive. That devilish face was speaking in tongues directly into my head, flashing on and off the screen full of furious rage. I jumped so high that I cracked my head on the ceiling, biting my tongue in the process. In a frenzy, I slammed the laptop shut and started packing up. Spent the remainder of the day building a new cabin door. The shed had the appropriate tools, and lumber was not in short supply. It was a daunting task, but I didn't mind. I kept my mind off the evil spirits prowling about. Before leaving, I snapped a pic of the cabin with the guitars leaning lazily against it. My beat-to-death harmony rested at the foot of the newly built log door, my Gibson next to it bursting with brilliance. A beam of radiant light spilled onto the guitars, giving them an angelic appearance. This would prove to be the album cover. I made it home by 9. With me came a new resolution, a reason to stick around a wee bit longer. I wanted to show off my new songs. I sent my recordings to the record company, who were over the moon. They thought the audience was a clever touch. I emailed the album art telling them to edit it to their liking. Then, using the footage from my iPhone and GoPro, I made a video for Hammersong. I gave the video a grainy tinge for ambience, blending close-up guitar bits with the full cabin experience. The dancing orbs in the background were barely noticeable. As I was uploading the video onto YouTube, an email arrived. It was from the record company. "Great stuff, Lucas. Here's the finished album cover. Hope you like it. We certainly do. Big things ahead." When I saw the album cover, I nearly died. They had cropped the pic and boosted the color, making the details much more intense. What first caught my attention was the name of the album, printed in simple lettering just below my name. Cabin Fever. Before I could wrap my mind around this anomaly, something else caught my eye. There was a face peering out from the crook of the window, transparent as though photoshopped. The face was eerily familiar. I zoomed in and gasped. "This makes no sense," I muttered under my breath. But then again, it made perfect sense. It was my grandmother. Addiction took our mother slowly, rocked her through it and sung her to sleep, sunk deep into the mattress on her bed. When her back teeth fell out, she left them on the side of the bathtub. I was 7, and I kept them in a matchbox. The missing pieces of her kept safe, so she wouldn't be lost forever. So maybe one day we could put her back together. Our house fell down around us, and we tried our best to raise ourselves. The ceilings had water damage, and the bottom stairs had dry rot, and in the winters, the radiators would bleed rust. But it was still our house, and Annie made it a home. My sister Annie mothered me, with lopsided band-aids on bruised knees and lukewarm microwave meals. She told me ghost stories and didn't mind when I crawled into her bed later on, too scared to sleep alone. She taught me to dance, barefoot on the living room carpet, music channel on full volume on the TV shaking our hips before we were fully grown. She always let me shower first so the water was hot, never complaining when she had to make do with the cold. She brushed my hair every day before school, even when I screamed and hit her when she caught the tangles. Annie was dark-haired like her father, whoever he had been, but I was blonde. Annie was desperate to be blonde too, like Marilyn Monroe, like Mom. I think she thought it would make them closer, remind Mom less of her dad. I'd give anything for her to have her hands in my hair one more time, even if it hurt. She moved to New York when I turned 18 and never came back. I still dream about her sometimes. Keeping up with our mother was impossible, and we learned from a young age we would always be left behind. It didn't make it any easier. When she was drinking light, she shone, would wake us up at 3 a.m. with pancakes dripping in cherry syrup. Sometimes when the weather was right and she'd had enough being drunk alone, she would call our school up and tell them we both had come down with summer sickness and we'd drive to the beach instead. I remember being 9 years old in the back seat of the car coming home after one of our ocean days, sucking the salt from my fingers. Annie had just dyed her hair blonde, her best friend Jane helping her bend over our kitchen sink. From behind I couldn't tell who was mother and who was daughter, radio up and windows down blowing the sky inside. When she was drinking heavy, she'd be out all night, hair piled up like a beauty queen, eyes glazed over and ringed with glitter and black. Sometimes she'd be gone for a day or two. She would never tell us when. One day we'd just wake up to an empty house and a fridge packed full, post-it note on the front with a smear of Mom's lipstick and the outline of a kiss, telling us she'd be back soon. Sometimes she'd bring guys home, filling the table with beer cans and ashtrays, smoke up the ceiling, Mom lost in the haze. We'd sleep with pillows over our heads trying to drown out the music they would blast until the AM, and wake up to strangers at our kitchen table in the morning asking us where we kept the coffee. When Mom drank too little, she fell apart. She wouldn't buy food, refrigerator a gaping hole in the wall. She'd chain smoke, leaving cigarette burns on the wallpaper up by the stairs like the walls were sick and decaying. She barely slept, walking around with blue half-moons under her eyes, knuckles raw. She would scream at the slightest thing. I remember once I spilled a glass of juice on the couch. She looked over at me with dead eyes and dragged me off onto the carpet and then took every single cushion off the couch and into the backyard and set them on fire. Annie went to watch a while from the window and then sat next to me on the floor, backs pressed against the skeleton of the seats, head resting in the crater of my collarbones. When Mom drank too much was the worst. She'd laugh too loud and too long at anything and everything until her mouth started to shake and she started crying at the breakfast table into her cereal. Annie shut down when Mom was like this, went somewhere deep inside herself where nobody could hurt her. She'd stay up until the morning watching old black and white movies on TV, whispering the lines she knew by heart like prayers. When I was 5, I'd cry when I'd find my mom passed out cold on her bed. Sure she would never wake up. Annie would wipe my tears, tell me she was only sleeping just like the princesses in my storybook. We'd sit on Mom's bed together and wait for her to wake up. When we were older, I was the one who would pick Mom up off the bathroom floor again and again, and Annie would put her to bed, smoothing her hair off her face and the vomit from her mouth, changing her clothes if she'd pissed herself. Watching them then, there was no doubt that Annie was the mother now. It was October and I was 13, Annie 16. It was a Wednesday night and Mom had been gone for 2 days. She'd called us that morning from a payphone, voice slurring down the line, telling us she was having the best time with all her new friends, hoping we were doing fine. When she asked me if I was having a good birthday, I hung up on her. My birthday had been the day before. Annie had given me a pile of presents, strawberry lip glosses and glittery nail polishes. I didn't ask where she got the money from. I didn't care. We'd taken the bus to the beach with Jane, eaten the birthday cake she had made for me, sand getting into the frosting. It tasted like sweetness in the sea, and I savored every bite and scrape of sugar against my teeth. We watched the sun go down. Annie snapping grainy photos on her shitty Nokia as I blew out my candles, wishing over and over that Mom wouldn't come home, that she'd just stay gone this time. But that Wednesday night, me and Annie weren't speaking. Anger hung heavy between us, seeping through the floorboards. It began when she tripped at the bottom of the stairs. We'd both laughed, Annie throwing her head back, gap between her front teeth catching the light. When I bent to pick her up, I'd caught her breath, warm against the freckles on my cheeks. I let go of her arms and she fell again, hitting the floor and grinning, shaking her hair from her face. Her breath was heavy with whiskey. I couldn't start picking her up too, couldn't watch her fall again and again. Just like Mom, I knew she'd never get back up. I'd stared down at her, blonde hair fallen into her eyes, and all I could see was our mother. And then I was running, feet slamming the hallway like heartbeats turned loose. I'd run for the kitchen and tipped every bottle we had down the sink, shoving Annie back as she fought to stop me, catching liquor on her fingers as it fell. She grabbed my shoulders and made me drop the very last bottle. It smashed between us on the floor, glass shards shining like we dragged the stars out of the sky and broken them, pieces we could never get back. Outside through the open windows, the sky turned pale gold, clouds a mess of pink and cream smeared across the horizon. I cried then, watching Annie on her knees picking up the pieces. That was Annie, always trying to fix things even when it was too late. The smell of food dragged me from my room, stomach turning traitor inside my ribcage. Annie was cooking pasta, real food not made in a microwave. She'd set the table, Tammy Wynette singing softly from the CD player, Annie gently swaying her hips as she stirred the tomato sauce, rich and warm. As we ate in silence, with every bite I forgave her. Mom never cooked dinner or remembered my favorite was spaghetti ever since I was a kid, or stayed sober long enough to sit up at a table. Annie wasn't Mom. We were washing the dishes when we first heard it. A moth was crawling down the inside of the pane and I cracked the window to let it out into the dark. From the backyard came a faint sound. I tilted my head to listen as it was coming from far off, crying. I figured it was Mika, the 2-year-old next door, having a tantrum loud enough for us to catch, or maybe even Lucky Strike, the cat junkies down the street, begging for food like he sometimes did. I always wanted to feed him when he came around, winding over my ankles, but Annie always stopped me, saying once you started giving them, they never stopped taking. Looking back, I don't think she was talking about the cat. Annie flipped the Christmas lights strung up around the porch, and we sat on the plastic beach chairs watching the skies. When we were little, we'd sit outside and Annie would tell me the names of all the constellations and the stories of how they came to be hung up in the night sky. I had to grow up before I realized she had made them all up as she went along. It was a game we still like to play now, making up ridiculous stories for the shapes we could pick out. Ah, yes. That one there is the Coors Light. It got there when God dropped it out of his convertible window and never picked it up, she said, nodding sagely and hiding her smile. Of course, I said, waving my hands and pointing up past the power lines, right next to the ashtray left there by angels on a smoke break. Yeah, they say if you wish on it, all your dreams will come true, said Annie, grinning. She stopped laughing, voice quieter, face tilted up to all those dead stars. Let's wish, Emmy, let's wish. And so we did. The sound of crying interrupted us. It was closer this time and definitely human. We turned to each other confused. Annie shrugged and I squinted out into the black. It sounded like a baby, lost and tired and alone. It must be Mika, I said, slowly getting to my feet. Maybe he walked around the back? Shit, do you want me to call Connie and tell her we'll bring him over? Annie didn't reply and I sighed, rolling my eyes. Guess I'll do everything then. I stepped off the porch, grass soft against my heels. The air smelled like it might rain. Fresh and clean and growing, a promise unfulfilled. Annie's voice was strained. I turned to her smiling. It died on my face when I saw the look on her own. Get inside now. She was staring out into the dark, past me, opening the door with one hand behind her, fingers fumbling on the catch. I froze, barefoot in the dirt. I'd found what she was looking at. In the bushes by the back fence was a person, crouched with their knees tucked up neat under their chin, arms wrapped around legs. Their mouth hung wide, softly opening and closing as he cried. Like a child lost in the dark. Not like a child, but someone pretending. Mimicking the sound opened and closed out in the blackness. Suddenly they straightened, snapping upright face still hidden by the black. They were tall and thin, too thin to be a normal person. Panic made me move. Animal instincts left over from the days we lived up in the trees carrying me forward. I was faster than Annie, dragging her inside and slamming the door behind us, hearing it bounce on its hinges as it locked. We watched as the person slowly walked towards the house, steps deliberate and long. Annie reached for my hand, holding me tight and turned me to face her, holding my shoulders. Don't turn around, Emmy. Don't turn around. Instinctively, I started to look over my shoulder out into the darkness. Annie grabbed my face hard and shook her head. I knew then she was serious. Her voice cracked and she cleared her throat, gripping my hand tight enough to hurt, nails digging in, grounding herself. I looked down at her fingers interlocked, both of us grown from the same bones. I'm gonna call the cops and everything is going to be... Her voice faltered, stuttering. Tears spilled over her lashes, dripping like a promise of rain. Annie never cried. Your phone's on the porch, she whispered, and bile crawled its way up my throat. Her phone was upstairs, charging. A soft tapping filled the silence. Annie turned to the window, eye whites showing, her eyes were so wide. It was the sound of someone's forehead against the glass, slowly, over and over. They started to speed up, faster and harder, skin meeting glass until they were slamming onto the window hard enough to shake the panes. The tapping stopped and I was about to ask Annie if I could look now when she screamed, followed by the sound of cracking glass and the loudest slam yet. Whoever was in our yard had just smashed their face hard enough into the window to break it. We ran upstairs, two at a time, skipping the ones caved in with dry rot on instinct. I turned behind me once Annie yanked my face back before I could see. The sound of broken glass echoed behind us as we made it to the bathroom, locking the door. A thin, wailing cry like a baby calling for its mother filled the hallway, trapped between the walls and locked doors. Annie threw her back against the door, feet jammed up against the bathtub, clutching the knife she had grabbed from the kitchen. I did the same, shoulder to shoulder. Slow footsteps started on the stairs, deliberate and casual. The crying had become mocking, almost laughter. Shrill bursts of sound and then giggles, high-pitched and abruptly stopping before starting again. The first door on the upstairs floor was my bedroom, and we heard the distinct sound of it slamming open. They were looking for us. "What the fuck is going on?" I asked Annie, not even bothering to brush away the tears that I couldn't stop falling. I watched my sister pick herself up off the floor and brace her hands on the door as we heard the sound of a second door slamming open. Mom's room. The next room on the hallway was the bathroom. Annie pulled me to my feet and handed me the knife. I shook my head and pushed it back to her, terrified of what would happen if I had to use it. Annie shoved me and pressed the knife into my hands, thumb pressing hard enough on the blade to bleed. I watched my sister's blood drip down her wrist, a winding red road, still pushing into my hands despite the pain. I took the knife. Something slammed against the wall that Mom's room shared with the bathroom. A high-pitched wail followed. I held my breath, could feel my heartbeat in the base of my throat, a wild and frantic thing. "I'm gonna get the phone from my room." I shook my head violently, about to argue. Annie clamped a hand over my mouth. I could taste the blood on her hand, salty and sweet, like birthday cake by the ocean. "Yes, I'm gonna get my phone, and I'm gonna call the cops, and we're gonna be okay." I shook my head again. "It's the only way. When I go, I need you to lock the door and you don't open it for anything or anyone. Not for me, not for anyone. Promise me." I shook my head and Annie pressed her hand into my mouth, crushing my teeth against my lips so it made my eyes water. "Yes, promise me, Em." Something smashed in the room next door. Annie brushed the hair off my face, gently tucking it behind my ear. "Promise," she mouthed, and unlocked the door as slowly as possible, bolts scraping gently. I watched the curve of her shoulder disappear into the black hall outside, like the moon in eclipse, and then she was gone. I couldn't move or breathe for a second, and then I slammed the bolt shut just as something bounced off the outside of the door. A high-pitched scream followed, handle rattling up and down hard enough to pop one of the screws. I watched it roll towards me on the tiles, and then silence. I sat with my back to the door, holding the knife and wishing I was holding Annie's hand instead. Still silence. Nothing but me and my lungs slowly filling the room with my breath. "Em?" came a voice through the door. I started, hands gripping the knife. "Honey, what's going on?" "Mom?" my voice cracked. "Mama, is that you?" I wrapped my arms around myself, shaking, trying to keep myself still. "Sweetie, it's okay, just open the door. It's okay, just let me in." The handle rattled again, gentler. "Just let me in, it's all okay." She banged on the door and I took my handle off the bolt. "Honey, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I missed your birthday. I'm sorry I'm such a terrible mother, please." Her voice broke and she started to cry. "Just let me in, baby, I'm so sorry." I screwed my eyes shut. She sounded so sad and so lost. I just wanted her to hold me like when I was a kid and I'd come in off the swings with the scraped knee. Maybe this time she meant it. Maybe it would all be okay. My hand found its way to the bolt again. My sister's voice came through the door, warm and gentle. "Yeah, Emily, let us in, it's all okay." My hand froze on the bolt and I tightened my grip on the knife. Annie never called me by my full name. A hand banged on the door, handle rattling. "Emily, let us in." Annie's voice became low and guttural, followed by the same shrill giggles from before. Mom spoke now, pleading and crying, voice getting louder and louder. "Let us in. Let us in.
Let us in."
Over and over again, punctuated by her fists on the door. I thought about demons and monsters. All the bedtime stories we prayed don't crawl out from under the bed. "That's not my sister and you're not my mother," I screamed through the door, hands over my head. I climbed into the bathtub and curled in a ball, cradling myself, knife clutched to my chest. I didn't know what it was outside that door, but I knew it wasn't Annie. It wasn't the voice that yelled at when I changed the TV channel, the one that sang me happy birthday, the one that told me I was smart even when I got bad grades, the one that read me stories about princesses that never wake up. It wasn't human. Bangs and yells came from downstairs, followed by footsteps of people running. A low guttural howl ripped through the house, filling the room until it felt like I was drowning in the sound, and then the door was kicked in. I screamed, covering my eyes, waiting to die. Arms found me and lifted me from the tub, carrying me from the room. I looked at the outside of the door as I was carried downstairs. It was covered in long scraping claw marks dragging down to the floor. Pillows ripped apart covered the hallway in soft down, like it had snowed inside. I watched them drift slowly as men in uniforms checked each one of the rooms that looked like they had been torn apart by something feral. Outside in our driveway were police cars and an ambulance. In the middle of it all was Annie, bathed in blue and red light as it washed over her, lit up in the dark like a neon angel, face aglow. I threw myself from the cop's shoulder and ran to her, holding us both together, broken pieces and all. Standing under all those constellations we made up. Gentle screaming came from the ambulance, which rocked occasionally. Annie gently turned my head away, smiling so sadly it made my chest ache as I understood. Turns out there was no demon, no wild animal or bad men trying to break in. Just Mom, out of her mind on booze and drugs and everything in between, coming to the end of a week-long binge. Something had finally broken inside her head, and this time we couldn't put her back together no matter how hard we tried. Sometimes you fall one last time and you never get back up. Annie had seen her in the garden, blood dribbling from her mouth, track marks bulging on her forearms like unmapped roads, rail thin and desperate for one more hit, one more fix. She'd searched the kitchen for all the drink I'd thrown away, and when she hadn't found it, had to come hunt for the stash she hid in the bathroom. She hadn't wanted me, just the drugs on the other side of the door. So high she could mimic Annie's voice almost perfectly. Turns out the real monsters are the ones that eat you alive slowly. The kind that come in a bottle or a needle or at the end of a long list of reasons of why you can't get out of bed in the morning. Sometimes the monsters are the ones that raise you or love you the most, but it's up to you if you let them in. As a psychiatrist of over 20 years, I've seen my patients come in many different types, all of them with their own personal flaws, some worse than others. There have been some instances in which I've met people with problems so bizarre that I've dwelled on them for days. These are the ones who'd come in, tell me their story, then right away I'd know they were screwed. Obviously, as a mental health professional, I'm not supposed to spill the beans on their situation so quickly. My job is to stretch out the treatments for as long as possible until the inevitable occurs. One patient in particular stood out. His name was Adam, and he was one of the unfortunate ones. It was hard for me to tell at first, as his life story wasn't exactly unusual or bizarre. However, he did have a condition that was rare: narcolepsy, a sleep disorder that would cause him to randomly fall asleep at inappropriate times throughout the day. This disorder tormented him his whole life, caused problems throughout his childhood, and he had trouble holding down a job later on. Despite this, he managed to find a wife that would stick by his side and assist him. She had a well-paying job as a nurse while he collected disability checks due to his ailment and inability to work. Other than being his lover, she was also a great caretaker. His wife was the best thing to happen to him. Before she came along, he had spent many years alone, confined to the dark and silent shadows of his home. Unfortunately, Adam had to return to the shadows as his wife went missing 10 years ago. Apparently, it took a great toll on him. As if dealing with his narcolepsy wasn't bad enough, he soon fell into a deep depression and went days without eating. His sleep habits grew even worse and he developed insomnia. Months after his wife went missing, Adam made his first appointment with me. When meeting with him, I got a strong impression of a shy and timid middle-aged man. He failed to make eye contact with me. He wouldn't stop looking at the ground and staring off into the space beside him every pause during our conversation. From then on, Adam has been seeing me on the regular, and over time we both kind of formed a bond. Compared to my other patients, I was invested in Adam's life and progressed the most, and really looked forward to seeing him every week. I'll admit, after a few years I started to consider Adam as part of my life, an acquaintance. But we had to meet later in the day, sometimes at night. Technically my office closed at 6, but I didn't mind making an exception for Adam and allowing him to come in an hour later past closing time. His narcolepsy wouldn't allow the appointments to be worth it if they started too early, so we used his insomnia as leverage for our sessions. Although he'd still randomly fall out on me from time to time, but for the most part it would work out. The first time the strangest thing happened was when Adam was in my office as usual during one of our sessions. "You've still been using your journal?" I asked him. Adam sat across from me on the other side of the coffee table that separated us. He slouched forward and rested his head on both his hands, staring at the carpet below. He didn't seem to be all the way there at the moment. "Adam?" He snapped out of it and looked me in the eye. Yes, I actually have," he replied. About 2 years ago, I gave Adam the task of jotting down his thoughts and feelings in his own personal journal. He told me it was a great way of venting, expressions of himself that only he could see. "Have you met any new friends or acquaintances to occupy your time?" Adam shook his head, no surprise there. I would ask him this question every month or so. As expected, I'd always get the same answer. During the past 10 years, Adam hadn't put much effort into meeting new people, as he rarely left the house for social gatherings. Outside of other personal occasions, the only time he stepped foot out of the house was for our sessions. "I've been going to some bars and late-night comedy shows," he said. I paused, then raised an eyebrow before grinning. "That's great. You go by yourself?" He nodded. "But I don't mean anyone when I go. At the bar I usually just sit and drink alone just to get out. And I find the comedy shows to be so enjoyable I often forget that I'm alone," Adam explained. "It's all good. You're finally starting to progress in this area. We're just taking one step at a time." I wrote down some things in my journal and was about to ask him another question, but when I glanced up, I was met with Adam staring off into space. He was just staring at me, or so it appeared. I smiled and leaned forward, waving my hands in front of his eyes. "Adam?" No response. I did that a few more times, but nothing changed, even after standing out of my chair and walking around him to get a reaction. Every now and then, Adam's narcoleptic behavior would surface, but he'd fall asleep for seconds, then be right back with me in no time. This is the first time he just zoned out like this. "Hey Adam, what's going on?" I said. His blank expression scrunched up into a face of sadness. Then his eyes began to water. "I'm sorry, Sasha," he cried as tears streamed down his cheeks. His wife. "I don't think I can do this with you gone," he continued, speaking to no one in particular. The tear streams on his face grew heavier. "Now I just need you to do one thing. Forgive me." Adam sobbed. "Adam," I exclaimed. Saying his name did no good. It was obvious he wasn't even present. "Forgive me." "Come on, Adam, get back with me now," I begged. "Forgive me." "Adam, forgive me." After repeatedly shouting those two words for the next 10 seconds or so, Adam abruptly stopped, then blinked 2 or 3 times before glancing around the room. He stiffened when our eyes met again. I was startled, and I figured he could tell by my heavy breaths my heart was racing. "What?" he muttered. "Did I fall out on you again?" I nodded. "Very," I replied. After that episode, I ended our session and sent Adam on his way, not bothering to tell him about the outburst. I wasn't even sure if he was aware himself. It was clear that he thought he'd just fallen asleep as usual. But that wasn't the case. Never had a patient just start talking in a trance mid-session. And what was he even talking about? Forgive him for what? At that time, my guess was that I wouldn't see an odd outburst like that one from Adam again. Maybe he was just really having a rough night and his issues just took a bizarre turn. I think you know where this is headed. 10 minutes before our next session the following week, I sat in my office filling out paperwork, waiting for Adam to walk in at any minute. As usual, it was about an hour past closing time. What had happened last session had me thinking. I couldn't wrap my head around what could have triggered Adam like that, or how something like that could even happen. I thought about it all day long, to the point I even went to the internet looking for answers. I didn't find much on what I was looking for, mainly because I didn't know exactly what I was looking for myself. Trying to describe what I had just witnessed was almost just as challenging as figuring out what was behind it. I visited many pages on the net about narcolepsy and other sleep disorders, but only came across generic and typical info. When Adam finally came trotting into my office, there was a slight jump in my chest upon laying eyes on him. He carried that typical blank and carefree expression I've looked at for the past decade now, that tense and anxious bodily posture as he came and took a seat in the leather chair across from me. I gave him a slight, welcoming smile, and then I noticed he was carrying a small black booklet in one of his hands. There was a band of elastic wrapped around it. His journal. Our session began and it was off to a pretty good start. He gave me some more good news. He went to another comedy show and gave the bar a few more visits throughout the week, but this time he built up the courage to be more social and talkative. Apparently Adam's been approaching and meeting people more often. During the past week at the bar, he hasn't been drinking alone. He enjoyed some meals and had drinks with a few guys there multiple times than the previous weeks. "Well, you made one hell of a leap," I said, growing excited for him. Adam smiled a little. It wasn't much, but it was still the happiest I've seen him since forever. I've tried asking a few of them to go to the comedy shows with me, but they all said they were unavailable, he explained. From there I dug deeper and was informed of many more updates on Adam's life and mental health. Surprisingly, things only got better as minutes passed. Adam made eye contact with me more often and was more expressive when he spoke. It was the best session we had in a long time, but like all good things, it didn't last. "So, how do you think Sasha would feel about you finally opening up to someone else?" I asked. When I asked that question, Adam froze with a smug grin stuck on his face, and he was silent for seconds. "Adam?" I waved my hands in front of his face and got no physical reaction, staring into space. It was happening again. Sasha wouldn't feel anything. She'd run away at the sight of me, Adam blurted out coldly. He'd lost grip of his journal and it toppled to the floor. "I hate myself for this, I really do," he continued. I gulped, staring Adam right in his unaware eyes. What do you hate yourself for, Adam?" I asked reluctantly. "I wasn't very nice, not as much as I should have," he replied. "I let the wrong emotions consume me, and now I've turned into something that resembles another person I don't like very much." At that point, I started to worry again, but something made me want to ask more questions. My curiosity was sparked, and I wanted to hear what else was on Adam's mind. Before I could get another question in, Adam was present again. Like before, he blinked multiple times before glancing around him. Also like before, I didn't tell Adam about the outburst and continued our session as usual. Over the next few weeks, the sessions with Adam remained similar to the ones as just mentioned before, except Adam seemed to grow happier after each week. As the weeks passed, he walked into my office with more confidence. The slight smile I saw before was growing wider. Our conversations were smoother, and it became more rare to lose eye contact with him. The good news he continued to present escalated. He was still meeting people at the bar and increasingly grew comfortable communicating with them. They were starting to feel more like friends, something that he hasn't really had since high school. He even started talking to a woman regularly and eventually managed to get her number, but he still complained of not being able to contact her outside the bar, as anytime he called or texted her, he wouldn't get a response. He also seemed to have trouble getting any of them to go to the comedy shows with him. Other than some small misfortunes, Adam claimed that his life was finally getting better, but his random outbursts said otherwise. Despite the fact that the sessions were overall drastically better after so many years, there were still moments when Adam would stop responding to my questions and give me that 100-yard stare. Every time this happened, I knew the comfort of the session was about to be sucked away. Surprisingly, it became easy to get comfortable with Adam's outbursts. He started out pretty subtle and innocent with the things he was saying. At first, he'd tell me about small random things from his childhood. He told me about his dog he was gifted at 6 years old and how he named him Toby. Toby was his first best friend and would be waiting for him in the driveway every day when he got off the bus. Toby had to be put down 2 years later. The only real friend I've ever had was taken away early, Adam sobbed. He was crying hard as he told me this. One week, Adam shared his experience as a member of his baseball team in middle school. Wasn't that great of a player and was benched for majority of the games, but when I hit that home run for the first time and got the win for the team, man, everyone was proud of me, Adam boasted, laughing joyfully. I heard more random things about his childhood, even the small and insignificant moments, like when he was caught staring out the window several times in the middle of class, and the other students laughed at him when the teacher called him out. At other times he'd mention a name, someone by the name of Kettlecucker. I heard a joke from the old Kettlecucker and it was funny as hell, Adam would say. He'd suddenly just mention this person randomly but never tell me exactly who it was. If I try to ask about this person, he always changed the subject. I'd try to ask Adam questions while he was in his trance. Sometimes I'd get good responses as if he was actually fully aware, but most of the time anything I said wouldn't reach him, and he'd continue rambling. As more weeks passed, I still hadn't told Adam about what he was doing. I wasn't sure if he'd still want to keep coming if he found out he was spewing out facts about his life on a subconscious level. The more curious part of me wanted to see how far things would go. If only I wasn't so nosy. Adam's subconscious path down memory lane took a dark turn. The decent memories of Adam's childhood, once a breeze to sit back and listen to, soon sent chills throughout me. Adam informed me that the first signs of narcolepsy occurred in the 6th grade and he frequently fell asleep in class. His father was very impatient and aggressive. Having to deal with Adam's ailment made him no happier. His father would shout and yell at him in frustration anytime he randomly fell asleep at home, and beat him down if his teacher called and said he dozed off in class. The bastard I knew had a sleep disorder, but he'd still beat my ass anyway, Adam once shouted in a rage. Apparently that's when he started to hate his dad, and he's felt that way about him throughout all his childhood. This supposed rage led him to getting into a couple fistfights with his father as a teenager. Adam told me he'd come home drunk when he was 15, and his father shoved him outside on the porch where he later fell asleep. He woke up in the same spot the following morning. At 16, he often stole his father's booze and snuck out in the shed at night to drink. I needed some kind of escapism, especially since leaving was off the table, Adam slurred, still giving that long-distance stare. One night while getting sloppy drunk out in the shed, he spotted a sledgehammer hanging on the wall. The thought of going into his father's bedroom with it crossed his mind. I was gonna bludgeon that fucker, but unfortunately I didn't have the guts to act on it, Adam blurted. I didn't shed a tear when the bitch drunk himself to death and destroyed his liver. This was the first time I've ever heard Adam use profanity. It caught me so off guard that my eyes widened. I bet if I had old Kettle Cucker back then, he'd cheer me up in a heartbeat. Man, does he say some funny shit. He mentioned him again. Kettle Cucker. Who was it? His thoughts would get even worse whenever I mentioned his missing wife. Have you ever told Sasha about the relationship you had with your dad? I asked him one week. This was one week in particular when I got lots of good responses from him in his trance. Adam took a deep breath, then to my surprise, he started crying. No, I've never mentioned a word to her about it, Adam sobbed, but it doesn't matter anyways. Sasha hated my guts. I stared back at his emotionless face in confusion. What? I said. I used to be a total brute towards her. I yelled and cursed at her a lot, and the slightest of mishaps would cause me to punch or slap her until she cried. He started bawling uncontrollably. But I took it too far one morning, he continued. Sasha fixed me a hot breakfast on a tray. When she brought it to the table, she dropped the entire thing, spilling everything on the tray in my lap, including some scalding hot coffee. In a rage, I repeatedly bashed her in the head with my fist and killed her. My eyes widened, then I swallowed in fear, still staring at him up and down. He was grasping his journal tightly by his side. I buried her in my backyard, and then after some time I called the police, pretending that I hadn't seen her in a few weeks. He whimpered. The only person that ever gave a shit about me is gone, and it's all my fault. Now all I have is Kettle Cucker to keep me company. He always makes me laugh, or at least puts a smile on my face to distract me from my piss-poor life. Kettle Cucker. Now scared shitless, I ask. Adam, who is this Kettle Cucker guy? In the middle of tears, Adam grinned, then he started laughing. He was genuinely creeping me out now. Kettle Cucker? Only the funniest old fart alive, Adam blurted. Obviously, his answer only brought me no closer to figuring out anything, so at the moment, I left the mystery alone. Days after that specific session, I sat at home ruminating once again. This is the most concerned Adam has made me in a while. Did he confess to a murder? I mean, he's been saying some pretty wild stuff, but I wasn't even sure how much of it was true, if any of it was true. I didn't know what action to take next. Contacting the police would have been questionable, as Adam wasn't even fully aware of state of mind when he made these confessions. The thought of seeing Adam again the next week seemed more terrifying. What possibly true event would he reveal next? I wouldn't get the chance to find out. Adam didn't show up anymore after that. In the following week, it was a half hour past our starting time. I sat in the office waiting, but there was still no sign of Adam. This was odd because he's never skipped a session without calling ahead of time. I called his phone a few times but couldn't get an answer. The same happened over the next few weeks. Now I was considering calling the police. Taking into account the fact that Adam has never ghosted me once, let alone 3 times without notice, combined with his confessions, made me decide to eventually pick up the phone. I turned on the television one day and found the authorities had already beaten me to it. The 5 o'clock news was on. I was shivering from head to toe when I saw Adam's picture appear on the screen. In the background, there were many paramedics carrying zipped-up bodies on stretchers. After listening to the reporter go on in the background for a few seconds, my heart began racing again. Adam was being charged with multiple counts of murder. I could see other people standing out in front of his house, crying and staring at the scene in disbelief. A few officers stood by to make sure they didn't get too close. I felt sick when I saw Sasha's picture appear on the screen shortly after. There was a caption, "Missing woman found," beneath in large red text. Fortunately, that woman wasn't alive. Then another picture appeared on screen of an older man with some gray hair. Strangely, this person was found alive, tied up and bound in Adam's basement. The name at the bottom of the picture caused my eyes to widen. John Kettlecucker. It was at that moment I realized Adam was spewing at least some truth in his trance-like states. I started looking back at the other confessions that he made, and the more I ruminated over our more recent sessions, the more I struck myself with abundant terror. The thought of Adam sitting in jail made me feel relatively depressed. During the first few weeks after I saw the horrid news, I could do nothing but think about the fact that my time with Adam was now history. The bond we formed. It had lasted so long that regularly seeing and communicating with Adam was something my brain craved and expected. I'll admit I started to miss him, despite what he's done. It took a minute for me to face the fact that yeah, he really did kill his wife and committed deeds much worse. After seeing the news, I did more research on the incident. As more time passed, more details and info made its way out to the public. Turns out Adam's life wasn't improving like he tried to make it out to be. Adam actually was opening up and talking to people more, just as he claimed. However, his interactions were very awkward and reeked with timidness. According to the many interviews I saw with people who regularly visited the same bar that Adam did, they had meals with Adam and often did hold conversations with him. But many of the interviewees admitted that it was all out of pity and sympathy, as Adam's lack of confidence was obvious. Adam's failure at creating a social life was internally making his feelings of loneliness worse, while also building up frustration and rage. Some recorded interviews with Adam himself revealed that his new way of dealing with his loneliness and frustration was to kidnap and hold some of the people he met at the bar captive. Adam made some real confessions during his interview, explaining how he lured his victims out to his car before using chloroform to knock them unconscious. Then he'd take them to his house and tie them up in his basement. Oddly enough, the reason he gave for doing this was to simply find someone to keep him company. He kept them in the basement and pretty much forced them to be his buddy. He'd hold conversations with them for hours, spending most of his days in the basement, communicating with total strangers. His victims were forced to watch TV with him, and he even cooked meals and brought them food. If Adam found his victim to be boring, or in Adam's words, bad company, he got rid of them right away. This was done by bludgeoning them to death with a sledgehammer, before burying them right next to his dead wife in the backyard. The same hammer I almost killed my father with, Adam said in an interview. Some of the bodies were discovered with terribly fractured skulls or large pieces of their cranium totally missing. He kept each person for about a week before killing them off and moving to the next one. Adam did this until he came across the older gentleman I saw on television earlier, John Kettlecucker. He was the comedian that performed at the comedy shows Adam often attended. After one of the shows, Adam wanted to personally speak to John. Adam met with John out by his car. After some friendly verbal exchange, John was of course chloroformed. Unlike Adam's other victims, Kettlecucker was held captive for weeks. His talent at making people laugh is what ultimately saved his life. The only reason Adam found John to be good company was because he enjoyed hearing his jokes for hours on end, other than his own life. He also saved countless others, as Adam would have alternately picked off John and continued taking the lives of many more on his quest to capture the best one. For months going on, I got a taste of what Adam has felt his whole life. Soon I was depressed and couldn't help but constantly think about Adam. Now he's doing prison. Whether or not he feels remorse for his deeds, has he thought of me? The idea of visiting Adam in prison even crossed my mind, but I knew that would be pushing it. I had to remind myself that he's my ex-patient, not a family or a friend. I had to move on and stop spending the end of every day in my office looking back at the version of Adam who was wearing a mask of someone he wasn't. While slouched up in a chair in my office one evening, I just so happened to see something stuck between the pillows of the sofa in front of me. Adam's journal. I realized it's been there for some time now, ever since Adam last came in. I didn't plan on cracking it open and wandering into Adam's mind anytime soon. Not that I wasn't curious. It's just the fact that only God knows what madness lies inside. I never wanted to be a police officer, at least not in the way that some of my colleagues did when they droned on about how they always wanted to be on the police force, even as little kids. Now they were always dressed in their precious little policeman costumes every Halloween, and did push-ups in their room at night, and went on ride-alongs after they graduated high school. All I actually heard was they were colossal kiss asses that relished even an iota of authority over others, either real or imagined. Don't get me wrong, I did actually want to be a police officer, and I did feel like I was doing something important. I think that's what made me get out of bed in the morning, but it was also just a job with a decent salary and a good pension, not some sort of phony higher calling. And I knew that I would have to put up with some bullshit, especially at the beginning. The washout rate of new hires was roughly 50%, so I fully braced myself for all the shit that was expected to come my way. Sorry, I'm probably being a little melodramatic. I might be a little jaded after everything I've seen in the past 25 years with the state police. In 1994, I finished the Louisiana State Police Academy and was given my first posting, a patrol assignment during the graveyard shift of 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. Not uncommon for a rookie assignment. My patrol zone was called Le Bateau, which was actually 3 adjoining bayou parishes all situated along the southwest corner of the coast. Le Bateau had a few working class towns along the one highway that connected them all, but was ultimately a poor and neglected part of the state. Between the small port towns, Le Bateau was almost mostly empty. No movie theaters, no sit-down restaurants, and definitely no available women. I wondered why anyone even bothered to live here, as there were surely better opportunities back towards New Orleans. Admittedly, everything about these bayous that I was assigned to put me on edge. There was just something I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe it was just a general atmosphere of the place. There were long, unpaved roads, the dim light of the oil tankers in the distance, the old weathered stone forts, covered by vines and nearly forgotten by time. I got a cold chill down my spine every time I heard the Gulf wind softly whistling through the trees. I think the worst part of the Le Bateau was that you never got the feeling that you were alone. When I would drive between the little towns, the trees seemingly enclosing me, it always felt like there was some dreadful presence out there, barely hidden from view, just waiting, watching. It would have been nice to have a partner to distract me, or even know that there would be backup if it was needed, but the state was not known for their fiscal abilities, especially not in those days. I guess I should have just been grateful for a patrol car and field to put it in. I did have a little company occasionally. A radio dispatch officer was stationed about 50 miles away, handled 911 calls for my section of the state, sending myself and other officers out to wherever we needed in our respective patrol zones. Other than that though, had little human contact during my shifts. I was called to break up the occasional bar fight or help someone jump their car's battery down at the steel mill, the area's largest employer. Most of my nights I spent cruising on the winding dirt roads along the coast, assuming the local fishermen may have some petty grievances that I would need to sort out. But I always did my job like I was supposed to. I didn't slack off or shirk my responsibilities just because I didn't like my bosses, the Bateau, or the fucking bayou. I showed up on time, responded to the calls, and wrote my reports. All by the books. And if the place made the hair on my back stand up, it didn't matter. I would get a promotion after a year or so and move on to better assignments. All I had to do was swallow my discomfort and pay my dues. One night I was sitting in my patrol car just trying to finish an incident report. I parked off the side of the little dirt road that ran parallel to the coast and connected two small towns. I'd picked this place to stop because it was right in front of an old church that I was convinced was abandoned, even if the sign out front was updated every Sunday. It was the only place on this road that wasn't surrounded by trees on either side, and I did not enjoy feeling claustrophobic out here in the dark. The rain was pouring so loudly outside that I could no longer hear the chitter of insects outside. I looked down at my report, which I was struggling with. An old man had called the police to report his daughter was missing, only for me to find out that the old man didn't remember her name, what year it was, or the fact that the daughter had moved out 20 years ago. I don't even know why I bothered. Absolutely no one was ever going to read this. As I watched rain droplets race down my windshield, I pulled a cigarette out and lit it up. The clock on my radio said 1:47 in the morning. I allowed myself to take pity on myself for a minute. Surely I wasn't going to get promoted for my thorough reports on poor old men with dementia. I rolled down my window enough to flick my cigarette butt out into the road and put it up quickly to keep the rain out. As I was about to take up my incident report again, the police radio lit up, illuminating my patrol car with its soft amber lights as it let out a series of crackles. I grabbed the handheld responder, waiting to hear from dispatch. The radio crackled again, this time followed by static. After waiting 10 or so seconds, I finally mashed the button on my responder, worried I was missing something important from the head office. Dispatch, this is Patrol 57. I missed your last message. Please repeat. Over. After a few seconds, the radio lit up again. Patrol 57, this is Dispatch. No message for you at this time. Over. I put my responder down and studied my radio for a second. Maybe it was just some local interference from an AM tower or a trucker and a shortwave radio passing me by on the highway about 15 miles north. The radio lit up again, this time going directly to static. I focused intently, trying to make out any words I might hear. The static continued, but a background whine was present as well. Its pitch went higher and lower, almost rhythmically, it seemed. I moved my head closer to the radio, listening as closely as I could. I swear that I heard a voice through the static, spoken as a whisper. Help me. And then all the noise from the radio stopped, leaving me in the darkness. As I reached up to turn on the overhead light, I could feel my mind churning at 1,000,000 miles per hour. I took in a big gulp of air and let it out slowly, then grabbed the radio's responder. Dispatch, Patrol 57 again. Please confirm again that no message has been sent. Over. The radio jumped back to life once more. Patrol 57 confirming no messages. Likely just interference. Please keep this channel clear, officer. Over. I could tell that there was an air of annoyance in the dispatcher's voice. I might have been a little irritated as well if I were in their shoes. I sighed and put on the radio's responder back on its hook. I sat for a minute in the darkness, wondering what I should do next. On one hand, I knew that dispatch was probably right about the message just being interference. Also, I might not even heard anyone speaking. Could have been just my brain trying to find something human in the overwhelming static. Almost like how you always seem to find faces and bodies in random patterns. On the other hand, I knew that I should investigate, just in case someone actually did need help. I shuddered at what horrid situation someone must be in if they're whispering for help on a shortwave radio at 2 in the morning. There was only one place they could be: the church. When I stepped out of my patrol car onto the dirt road, I was soaked within seconds. I pulled my hat down tightly over my forehead, trying to keep the rain out of my eyes. Then I grabbed the heavy flashlight off of my belt and twisted it on, throwing light on the wooden sign in front of the small, ramshackle church. Underneath the church's name was a Bible quote: "Rejoice, for he is always present." Unsurprisingly, it wasn't nearly as reassuring as one would hope as I stood in the rain, preparing myself to walk up to the church. There was a narrow drive that led up to the side of the property of the church. It must have been only 60 or 70 feet, but in that moment it might as well have been a mile. To the left of the drive was the church's front lawn, the grass tall and overgrown with weeds. To the right, however, was the edge of the bayou forest. The trees and brush were so thick that you could never see more than a few feet in, even in daytime. I don't know what worried me more, the impenetrable jungle or the decrepit church. I slowly walked up the small drive, the mud squelching beneath my feet. I kept my light pointed into the trees lining the right-hand side of the drive, occasionally looking over my shoulder in case the rain drowned out the sound of something behind me. As I looked forward again, something in the trees caught my eyes. When I turned and pointed my flashlight into the brush, the shining pair of eyes were staring back at me. I didn't even get a good look before the eyes disappeared in a flurry of movement, concealed by a thick underbrush. I stood and stared into the jungle for a moment before I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to slowly exhale and try to breathe regularly. Shouldn't be this tense. I was a police officer, goddammit. What are you gonna do next time? Shoot at a raccoon in someone's garbage? Fucking coward. I kicked myself mentally, then forced myself to quickly power myself up the remainder of the drive and onto the steps of the church. I reached the landing in front of the church doors and knocked. "Police," I yelled. "Is anyone here?" I held my ear to the door but didn't hear any movement. I waited 30 seconds and knocked again. Nothing. I stepped over to the corner of the landing to a small window and peered in. I had to cup my eyes around my face to block out the glare of the moonlight. I could see a relatively small room filled with a dozen or so wooden pews and an altar at the back. Behind the altar was an impressively large crucifix with the ceramic figure of Jesus attached to it. Even with almost no light, I could see the pained expression on his face. Enough of this, I thought. If there's someone here, they've had ample warning. I grabbed the doorknob and gave it a try. Surprisingly, it turned. The door was unlocked. I gave the door a slight push and stepped back as it swung open with a soft groan. I pointed the flashlight into the meager room, dutifully examining every corner before I entered. Took a few steps in and yelled again, "Police, is there anyone here?" When no one answered, I went down the aisle between the 2 rows of pews. I could see a thin layer of dust on each of the wooden benches. I got the impression that this church hasn't had any congregants in a while. As I walked, it felt like ceramic figures' eyes were following me, no matter where I stepped. Even when I looked down at each pew, I could feel the eyes in the side of my head, and I would quickly turn to face the altar. I found a doorway to my left when I finally made it up the altar. The door was open and I pointed my light into the dark room. There was a small kitchen with old appliances lining the far wall, a sink on one end, and a round wooden table with 4 chairs. I found a light switch on the wall when I walked into the kitchen. The room began to softly hum as the fluorescent lights above the kitchen table came on. Not sure why I didn't look for a switch in the main room when I first entered the church. Maybe the building looked so old to me that I just assumed it didn't have electricity. That's ridiculous, I thought. Even the poorest areas of Le Bateau at least have electricity and running water, regardless of how low my opinion of it was. Standing in the entrance to the kitchen, there was one door to my right, along with the window next to it overlooking what I assumed was the backside of the church building. When I stepped over to the window and peered out, I shuddered. It was the church's cemetery, filled with tall granite headstones, most of them covered with black mildew from decades of rain and neglect. Behind the headstones was a forest of reeds. I realized that it must have been a marsh or some sort of tidal area. These weren't uncommon on the coast. Obviously, I imagined all of the local wildlife hiding just a few steps into the marsh waiting for their next meal. In the other corner of the room towards the front of the church was yet another door. If there was anyone here, this was the only other place they could be. Having a bit more courage with the light on, I marched towards the door and quickly flung it open. The brightness of the kitchen contrasted with the darkness of this new room made me stop for a few seconds and let my eyes readjust. When I could finally see clearly again, I found myself looking into a bedroom that appeared to be mostly empty. I saw a small television in front of me sitting on top of a weathered gray carpet. In the corner was a short wooden dresser with what appeared to be an old radio on top. Then I noticed the twin bed in the far corner. I stopped still. There was someone in the bed. I could see what I assumed was the back of an old man's head based on the short white hair. In the narrow corridor of light coming from the kitchen, I tiptoed towards the bed. It felt like an eternity to cover the few steps of the old man, but when I finally made it, I gently laid my hand on his shoulder. I didn't even try to shake the old man awake. He was so stiff and so cold that even I, inexperienced as I was, knew he was dead. Radio dispatch told me it would be several hours before a coroner would arrive to pronounce the old priest dead and fill out the old relevant paperwork. Until then, I was to stay put and keep the area secure. Fortunately, no one was around to see me roll my eyes at this command. I decided to sit at the church's small kitchen table to do my paperwork, with the bedroom's door firmly shut. I didn't like my directions to secure the scene, whatever that meant, but I didn't feel like waiting in my patrol car was technically what I was supposed to be doing. It was probably safer to hang out inside and keep an eye on things. After the whispered message on the radio, I oddly felt safer in the outdated kitchen than I did outside in my dimly lit squad car in the middle of nowhere. But this did raise an important question to me. Was the message that I heard real? I mean, it did lead me to find the old man. Or was it simply a coincidence? Most priests that I encountered here in the Bayous were fairly old, so this scenario didn't seem particularly unlikely. But if it was real, how did it get sent? Did the priest contact me from beyond the grave? Why would he need help? Unfortunately, I didn't have time to dwell on it. I could hear a soft buzz coming from the bedroom. I sat in silence for a moment, unsure of what was happening. Hesitantly, I stood up and went over to the bedroom door as the buzzing grew louder. I slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open, keeping one hand on the wall inside the kitchen. Then I knew exactly what the noise was. Atop the wooden dresser in the corner, the radio was on and emitting the same static that I heard in my patrol car earlier. I don't know if I stayed in the doorway because I was so terrified that my legs refused to work or because I was simply dumbfounded. Either way, I stood in place, transfixed on the radio. The radio did the same pattern as before, static with the background whine whose frequency went higher and lower in a uniform pattern. But then, abruptly, all noise stopped. "Help me," a voice screamed at me from the radio. My heart sank. This time there was no mistaking the message from my imagination, and even worse, the voice was not that of an old man, but instead of a child, a boy. I don't know what I expected to happen, but for some reason in the panic of the moment I decided to yell out, "Where are you? Are you in trouble?" I stood, still frozen in the doorway, holding my breath and waiting for the radio to give me an answer. Instead, the radio let out a gentle humming noise. As I stood and listened, the hum gradually got louder and louder, switching from a hum to a whine. Before I knew it, a high-pitched squeal was filling the church and rattling every bone inside my head, making me feel like my brain was in a vice. As a final act, the radio sent out a shower of sparks from its corner of the room, briefly illuminating it like the flash of a lightning strike. I jumped, squeezing my eyes shut and clenching my fists. The noise had to come from behind me, near the back door to the cemetery. When I turned around, nothing seemed out of place, but the noise had clearly come from outside. I peeked back into the bedroom. The priest was still there. A scorched radio sat in its place on top of the dresser. I decided that the poor old man wouldn't go anywhere and nervously grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen table. As I moved towards the back door, I realized where the noise had come from. On the window was a handprint. It was small, the size of a child's hand. But I had looked out of this window earlier and didn't notice any handprint. It had to be new. When I got to the window, I could see that the handprint was a dirty brown color, almost like whomever's hand that was made this print had been covered in mud. I felt the hot, moist air hit me as I opened the back door. It had finally quit raining, allowing me to step outside without being drenched. I shined my flashlight down the worn concrete steps and into the cemetery. The headstones certainly didn't look any less ominous than they did from the window earlier. As I stepped down the steps and into the cemetery, I looked at one of the headstones. Michelle Levesque had died and been buried here in 1849. How old was this place? There must have been 50 or so headstones in this cemetery, all in similar states of despair. Most of them were standing off kilter and nearly black from the decades of Louisiana weather. Keeping this place maintained must not have been part of the deceased's duties. I moved deliberately through the small graveyard, pointing my light behind each of the headstones as I went past. If the priest had been alive, he probably could have heard my heart pound from inside his bedroom. I kept moving until I reached the last row of graves. I stopped. On the back of the headstone nearest to me was another small, muddy handprint. Swoosh. It was the sound of reeds brushing together. I twisted my head over towards the marsh, just a dozen steps or so behind the cemetery. Standing directly in front of head-high reeds was a boy who couldn't have been older than 8 or 9 years old. I don't know why this sticks out of my memory, but I distinctly remember that he was wearing a scout's uniform, dark blue with classic shorts and high socks, badges littering his chest. Then I saw his face. His eyes were completely black. They were so intensely dark that he may not even had eyes for all I know. This was a distinct contrast to his face, which was a sickly shade of white bordering on translucent. On his face there was an unmistakable expression of sadness. The boy's expression soured as he tilted his head. He opened his mouth and I fully expected to hear a foul, ear-piercing scream. Instead, what came out was barely a whisper.
"Why won't you help me?"
The boy murmured woefully. Then in a swift motion, he turned and began walking along the edge of the marsh. I stood in stunned silence for what felt like hours, watching the boy move away from me. I realized that I had to act. Somehow I convinced my legs to overcome whatever fear or inertia was holding me in place and followed after the child, or ghost, or whatever had just stood in front of me. I followed behind the boy alongside the thicket of reeds that outlined the marsh. He was moving much faster than I expected, and I had to pick up my pace to keep him in my sights. We left the boundary of the church's backyard and into the thick bayou brush. I kept my eyes on the boy as soon as I dodged vines and fallen trees. He always seemed to be a fair distance ahead of me. Only when I had reached a small clearing did I lose the boy entirely. I spun around, swinging my flashlight wildly. Somehow I had managed to keep a hold of it in the scramble through the woods. There was nothing. Somehow I had lost the boy and found myself standing in ankle-high mud. I strained my eyes as I looked around, desperate to find a sign of where he might have gone. Why would he bring me out here? Was it to kill me? Was this some kind of trap? My heart suddenly picked up its pace. I was desperate to get out of this swamp as quickly as I could. I told myself that as soon as I got back to the church, I would jump in my patrol car and get out of this nightmare. Dead priest be damned. The coroner could figure it out all in daylight.
"Help me."
The whisper behind me threw my heart into a frenzy and I panicked. attempting to turn and back away at the same time, only to fall on my back into the sticky mud that I had been standing in. The boy was now a few feet away, still with the look of despair on his face. Unexpectedly, he turned himself to the side and pointed towards the marsh beside him. "Help me," he whispered again. I finally knew why I had been brought here. Slowly, I stood myself up, trying to remove the mud off my hand and arms. I stood still for a moment, watching the little boy. He stood firmly like a statue, still pointing into the marsh. I gave him a wide berth as I crept around him, making sure to never face away. When I got a few feet away, I let myself look at where he was pointing, trying to keep him in my field of vision. I searched around in the mud for a moment, unsure of what I was looking for, and then I saw it. A small, circular object stuck partway out of the marsh. I stared at it for a second. My thoughts scrambled, but when I picked it up, I knew exactly what it was. A merit badge. "Is this?" I started to ask as I turned back to the boy, but the boy was gone. Somehow in the half second I had turned away from him, he had vanished. I turned back to where I had found the merit badge and dropped to my knees, halfway sinking into the muck. And then I started to dig, frantically scooping mud away with my hands. I dug with an urgency that I didn't even know existed in me. I found myself breathing heavily, realizing that the waterlogged muck was much heavier than I expected, but I knew that I couldn't stop, not until I found the boy. I finally cleared all of the mud off the boy's body sometime after sunrise. I had thought about bringing him back up to the church as it seemed like a decent thing to do, but realized that he would have to be photographed and documented by the coroner and crime scene group. I was busy chain smoking the rest of my cigarettes on the front steps of the church when the coroner finally arrived. Seeing me covered in mud and nervously tapping my foot, the coroner sent me home to shower and take a nap before I was to come up to the dispatch office and give my statement to another officer. I gave my statement to the best of my memory, radio, ghost, and all. I knew that they would say that I was either crazy or lying, and I worried that I may end up in even a worse patrol or potentially fired, but there was no other reasonable explanation for how I found the boy's body. When the statement was typed up and handed me to sign, I realized that almost everything about the radio and the boy had been left out. I signed it. No one ever brought it up again. I certainly didn't, not until now. They solved the boy's case pretty quickly. He had been missing since 1981, and the original investigator had always suspected the boy's father, but had never been able to make a case without a body. Apparently the marsh, with its thick mud squeezing out any oxygen, had preserved the boy's body so well that there was enough remaining trace evidence to finally convict the father. I think he's still on death row, appeal pending. As for the priest, the coroner determined that he died of natural causes. A heart attack, miles away from any sort of help. The archdiocese had assigned a new priest to the old church within a few days. A fairly young guy too. I felt sorry for him considering everything that happened there. If it were up to me, I would have had the place torn down. I still don't know why the boy picked me. Why he didn't reach out to the priest still doesn't make sense to me. Maybe he did for all I know. But I remember that I didn't sleep normally for a week after that horrible night at the church. Every time I turned a corner, my heart raced, expecting him to be standing there. The memory of his desperate face and pointing towards his marshy grave etched into my memory. I visit the marsh every year. Sometimes I bring flowers and place them at the edge of the marsh. I know that the boy isn't physically there anymore, and I hope that whatever part of him that remained and led me to his body has finally left. Maybe that's why I visit, just to reassure myself that he's not still there. I always make sure to bring along a radio.